For more than a century, the story of the Viking Age has been told as a story of men, warriors, kings, traders, raiders. The women, when they appeared at all, stood in the background wives, mothers, caretakers, objects of history, not its makers. But the ground tells a different story. In the last episode, we talked about Adam of Bremen, the German chronicler who wrote about the temple at Uppsala. He described golden chains and human sacrifices and the triple throne of gods. He had never been there. He was writing from his own assumptions, his own framework, and his desire to portray the heathens as barbaric. And for centuries, historians took him at his word. We know now that much about what Adam wrote was not accurate. The temple he described probably didn't exist. He was seeing the old religion through his own lens, interpreting it in ways that served his own purposes. Something similar happened with the women of the Viking Age. Archaeologists looked at the graves filled with weapons and assumed the bodies inside were male. They looked at runestones raised by women and treated them as exceptions. They read the sagas and dismissed them as fantasy. They brought their own assumptions, their own frameworks, and their own ideas about who held power and who didn't. And for more than a century, those assumptions went unquestioned. This episode is about what happens when we stop assuming, when we let the ground speak for itself, when we ask new questions of old bones and old stones and old stories. This is the story of the women who lived, traveled, fought, traded, ruled, and died in the Viking Age. The ones the postcards forgot, the ones the scholars misread, the ones now emerging from the soil. In 1878, a Swedish archaeologist named Heimler Stolpe began excavating at Birka on the island of Björkö in Lake Mälaren. Birka was one of the most important trading centers of the Viking world, a place where silver from Baghdad met furs from the north, where ships left for Constantinople and came back with silk and stories. Stolpe was meticulous. He recorded everything. He numbered each grave, each artifact, each bone. He was one of the first archaeologists to work with this kind of precision we expect today. Among the graves he excavated was one he labeled BJ 581. BJ 581 was unusual. The grave was a chamber built of wood, set beneath a large stone boulder near the garrison. Inside, Stolpe found the remains of a person, and surrounding them, he found a sword, an axe, two spears, two shield bosses, 25 arrowheads, and a full set of gaming pieces, including a king's piece. This is Nifltafel. Two horses, a mare and a stallion, were buried alongside. The person was dressed in silk, silver brocade, a tasseled hat made of samite, a luxurious fabric from the Middle East or Central Asia, and in the grave there was a quarter silver dirham dated between 913 and 933. This was, by any measure, an elite warrior burial, the kind of grave that suggested high status, military leadership, strategic skill. The gaming set is particularly significant because in Viking culture, Nefltavl was a game of strategy and command, played by leaders who made decisions that affected everyone under their authority. Stolpe assumed the person was male. For nearly 140 years, everyone assumed the person was male. The grave became a model for what professional Viking warriors looked like. It was referenced in textbooks, in museum displays, in scholarly literature. BJ 581 was a warrior, male, unquestioned. In the 1970s, an osteologist, that's someone who studies human bones, examined the skeleton from BJ 581 and suggested that it might actually be female, and the findings were set aside. In 2014, Anna Shellstrom, a bioarchaeologist at Stockholm University, looked at the remains again. She noticed several characteristics: a broader sciatic notch, a wide preauricular sulcus, a small pointed chin. These features are more commonly associated with female skeletons. Shellstrom asked two colleagues to evaluate the remains independently without telling them what she suspected. Both concluded the same. The skeleton was female. In 2017, a DNA study led by Charlotte Hedenstern Jonsson at Uppsala University confirmed it. The skeleton from BJ581 had two X chromosomes and no Y chromosome. The person buried with the sword and the axe and the two horses and the gaming set and the silk and the Semite hat was biologically female. Isotope analysis revealed something else. She was not from Birka. She had likely grown up in southern Sweden or Denmark, and her teeth showed signs of extensive travel. This is a pattern associated with high ranking elites who moved across the Viking world. When the study was published, the reaction was immediate. Some scholars questioned whether the weapons truly belonged to the woman. Perhaps a male body had been removed from the grave. Perhaps the weapons were family heirlooms, not personal possessions. Heidenstern Jonsson and her team responded. The grave was undisturbed. Stolpe's documentation was meticulous. The distribution of grave goods arranged around the skeleton clearly associated them with the individual. The gaming set found among her possessions was a sign of strategic skill and military leadership. She noted something striking. Since the site was excavated in 1870, it has consistently been interpreted as a warrior grave because it looks like a warrior grave and it's placed by the garrison and by the hill fort. Nobody has ever contested it until the skeleton proved to be female, and then it was not a valid interpretation anymore. Let that sit for a moment. A grave that had been a warrior grave for 140 years, cited, taught, displayed, was questioned the moment people realized the person inside it was a woman, not because the evidence changed, because the assumption changed. This is the same pattern we saw with Adam of Bremen. He looked at the old religion through his own framework, saw the temple that wasn't there. Archaeologists looked at a warrior grave through their own framework and saw a man who probably wasn't there. The woman in BJ 581 was over 30 years old when she died. She was tall, she had traveled, she lived in the heart of the Viking world, in a town that connected Scandinavia to Baghdad, to Constantinople, to the rivers of Eastern Europe. She was buried with the tools of her trade: sword, axe, spears, arrows, gaming set, two horses, silver and silk brocade, a tasseled hat from the East. She was not an anomaly. She was not an exception. She was a woman of the Viking Age, buried as she lived, with honor, with weapons, with the full recognition of her community. For 140 years, we assumed she was male. But now we know, not because the evidence changed, but because we finally asked the right questions, because someone looked at the bones instead of the assumptions, because DNA can tell us what our eyes could not. The woman, engraved BJ 581, was a warrior, a leader, a person who traveled far, who held a sword, who played the king's game, who was buried with honor among the military elite of one of the Viking world's most important towns. We didn't see her for 140 years, but we see her now. I've spent time at the Gotland Museum in Visby. If you've been there, you might have seen the display on women of the Viking Age: brooches, beads, and keys. Keys appear in countless female graves across Scandinavia. They are small, often made of iron, sometimes elaborately decorated. At first glance, they seem practical, tools for locking and unlocking chests, doors, and storage rooms. But in the Viking Age, keys were more than tools. They were symbols. A woman buried with keys was remembered as the one who managed the household, the one who controlled the access to food, to clothing, to the resources the family needed to survive. When men left for trading voyages or raiding expeditions, sometimes for years at a time, women held the keys. They managed the farms, they supervised labor, they made economic decisions, they held the household together. The keys were not just practical, they were a statement of authority. But there was another kind of labor that women performed, and it was anything but domestic. It was industrial. Viking ships required sails. This seems obvious, but the scale of it, the sheer amount of labor required to outfit a single ship, is almost unimaginable. In 2004, mental archaeologists at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, Denmark, reconstructed a Viking sail. They used historically accurate methods, shearing sheep, processing the wool, spinning it into thread, weaving it on a loom, treating it with tallow and oil. They calculated that a single sail for a large warship required approximately 10,269 hours of labor. That's nearly 4 years of work by one person. But here's the thing, one person couldn't do it alone. The sail needed to be woven on a warp weighted loom, which required two people to operate. The wool needed to be processed before it could be spun, and spun before it could be woven, and woven before it could be treated. A team of women working together could produce a sail, but it was not a casual undertaking. It was an industrial scale operation. And that is just the sail. Outfitting a crew of 70 required as much as 17.5 years of labor for clothing alone. The women who produced these textiles held essential economic power. Without their labor, the ships didn't sail. Without the ships, there was no Viking Age. At the Gotland Museum, among the brooches and the keys, there are spindle whorls, small, often overlooked, easy to walk past, but each one represents hours of work. Days, years, generations of women spinning thread, weaving cloth, making it possible for ships to cross the North Sea and the Baltic and the Atlantic. A spindle whorl found at Lanso Meadows in Newfoundland proves that women reached the New World with the Viking expeditions. 1,000 years before Columbus, women were spinning wool in North America. That's the other story, the women who didn't stay home. Iceland was uninhabited when the Vikings arrived. A permanent population required women to make the journey. Families heading for North Atlantic colonies traveled in open ships with no protection from the elements. They brought livestock, tools, seeds, everything they needed to establish new farms. The journey was brutal. Days or weeks on open water, no shelter, no privacy, no guarantee of arrival. But women made it. The settlement of Iceland is one of the best documented migration events in Viking history. According to the medieval Icelandic sagas and archaeological evidence, women came as settlers, not just as wives. They claimed land. They established farms. They became founders of dynasties that would last centuries. One of them was Aud the Deep-Minded. We'll meet her in the next chapter. But she was not alone. Place name evidence from England tells a similar story. Finds of Scandinavian style female jewelry, particularly in Lincolnshire, suggest significant Scandinavian female immigration to England throughout the 10th century. These finds correlate with Scandinavian place names in the same region, like Grimsby, Whitby. Names still mark the landscape, and beneath them, in the soil, brooches and beads that belong to women who crossed the North Sea and built new lives in a foreign land. Recent archaeological work in western Norway at a site called Skumsnes has uncovered something remarkable, a cache of graves belonging to wealthy Viking women, buried with silver coins from the Frankish Empire and glass beads from distant lands. These women were not locals. They had traveled, perhaps married into the community from abroad, bringing their wealth and their connections with them. One of these women was buried in a stone ship, a boat shaped arrangement of stones meant to carry her into the afterlife. Along with her ship, she was buried with textile tools, indicating her respected profession. Textile production was prestigious. Farms that produced fine clothing held high status. A bronze key buried with her represented her role as head of household. The eastern routes too carried women. Female graves containing eastern goods, silk, glass, Arabic coins, suggest women traveled the river routes as traders, settlers, or perhaps as part of diplomatic marriages. The woman in grave BJ 581 with her Samite hat and her silver brocade shows Eastern cultural influences reaching into the highest ranks of Viking society. She was not the only one. At the Nordic Museum in Stockholm, you can see artifacts from this connected world. Brooches that travel thousands of miles, beads that cross continents, objects that belong to women who saw horizons most people could only imagine. There was also the Westness woman, excavated from a grave in Orkney, Scotland. She was buried in the 9th century with a fine brooch, a silver ring, and a knife. Typical female grave goods, but the style of her brooch and the objects around her suggest she was a Viking settler, part of the Scandinavian diaspora that spread across the North Atlantic. She was likely a woman of high status, perhaps the wife or a daughter of a chieftain who made the journey from Norway to the Northern Isles and established a new life there. These women traveled, they settled, they traded, they built new lives in new lands, carrying their culture with them in the form of brooches, keys, and weaving tools. 1903, a farmer in Vestfold, Norway, dug into a mound on his land and found something extraordinary. Beneath the earth was a longship, ornately carved, sleeker than almost anything recovered from the Viking Age. And inside it, the remains of two women. The Oseberg ship is one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries ever made in Scandinavia. The ship itself is more than 21 meters long, made of oak, decorated with intricate carvings of animals and interlaced patterns. It had been buried in clay, which preserved it nearly intact. Inside the burial chamber, the two women had been laid on a bed. They were surrounded by tapestries, wooden chests, a wagon, four sledges, and the remains of horses and oxen. One of the women was in her 70s, the other was in her 50s. The younger woman showed signs of having died violently, blow to the collarbone that may have killed her. For decades, the Oseberg burial was interpreted as a queen and her servant. The older woman was a queen, the younger was sacrificed to accompany her. But more recent analysis suggests something different. The younger woman had a spinal condition that would have given her a distinctive tilted posture. Her teeth show grooves consistent with using her mouth to hold objects, threads perhaps, or tools used in textile work. She may have been a sorceress, a ritual specialist, a woman who held power of a kind we don't fully understand. And the older woman? She was buried with objects associated with magical practice. A whalebone plaque, often interpreted as a seeress's staff, a pouch of seeds, the bones of small animals. She may have been a vulva, a practitioner of Sather, a Norse magical tradition. According to archaeologist Neil Price, author of The Viking Way, magic was as important to Viking warfare as sharpening your sword. And most of that magic was conducted by women. Sorceress, vulvar, held powerful positions in Viking society. They were said to predict the future, control the weather, and perform battle magic, dark rituals that could turn the tide of the war. They traveled from farm to farm, dressed in distinctive clothing, and were paid for their services. The Oseberg queen may have been such a figure, buried with the tools of her ritual practice, honored in death as she had been in life. But the Oseberg women are not the only examples of powerful women in the Viking world. In Denmark, recent research has brought new attention to a woman named Thyra. Her name appears on 4 runestones from the 10th century, more than any other person of any gender. The larger yelling stone raised by Harold Bluetooth mentions his mother, Thyra. The smaller yelling stone raised by Harold's father, Gorm, calls her Denmark's salvation or Denmark's strength. A new analysis of the yelling stone revealed that the same rune carver, a man named Roung Tung, carved both the larger yelling stone and a stone at Leiborg, which explicitly calls Thyra queen. Archaeologist Lisbeth Emir of the National Museum of Denmark puts it this way: no other person in Viking Age Denmark is commemorated on so many stones, not even Harald Bluetooth, her famous son. So she must have been very important for forming the state. Thyra was not just a king's wife. She may have been a ruler in her own right. There is another story from this world. A woman whose life was recorded not in the ground but in sagas. A woman whose story is so detailed, so specific, that scholars believe it is not a myth but history. Her name was Aud the Deep-Minded. She was born in the Hebrides, the daughter of a Norwegian chieftain. She married a Viking based in Dublin, one of the Norse kings who controlled parts of Ireland. When both her husband and her son died, took charge of the family fortunes. She organized the ship. She led her followers, her household, her dependents, her people, first to Orkney, then to the Faroe Islands, finally to Iceland. Iceland had been discovered but not yet settled. Aud claimed land in the west of the island in a region now called Prey the Further. She established a farm, distributed land to her followers, and became one of the island's four most important settlers. And she did something else. She became Christian. In a world still dominated by the old gods, Aud the Deep-Minded chose the new faith. She had crosses erected on the hills above her farm. She marked her land with the symbol of a god she had never grown up worshiping. Her descendants included some of the most powerful families in all of Iceland. Her story was recorded in the Laxdæla saga, one of the great works of medieval Icelandic literature. Aud was not a myth. She was a woman who crossed the North Atlantic, claimed land, ruled her household, and chose her own beliefs. She was a chieftain in every way that mattered. But the sagas also give us figures who may be more legend than history. Women like Ladgerda, better known today as Lagertha. If you've watched the History Channel series Vikings, you know Lagertha. She's played by Catherine Winnick, and she became one of the most iconic characters on the show, a shield maiden, a queen, a warrior who fought with her hair unbound. The show's Lagertha was a protector, a grieving mother, a woman who never broke, even when the world broke around her. The historical Ladgerda appears in the writings of Saxo Grammaticus, a Danish chronicler from the 12th century. According to Saxo, she fought alongside the legendary hero Ragnar Lothbrok, dressed as a man, and impressed him so much with her courage that he sought her hand in marriage. We don't know if Ladgerda was real, but the fact that the sagas told stories about women warriors, that audiences accepted those stories as plausible, tells us something about the Viking world. The idea of a woman with a sword was not impossible. It was not ridiculous. It was worth writing down. And beyond the Viking Age, powerful women continued to shape Scandinavian history. One of them was Catherine Sune's daughter, a queen of Sweden in the 13th century. She married Eric the 11th, but was widowed only after a few years, and then something changed. As a widow, Catherine became legally independent for the first time in her life. She controlled an immense inheritance, including the towns of Nyköping and Söderköping. She donated much of her wealth to a convent where she lived until her death. Her tomb monument, a richly adorned stone chest, can be seen today at the Swedish History Museum in Stockholm. Catherine was not a Viking woman. She lived in the medieval period long after the Viking Age had ended, but she represents something that began in the Viking Age: the idea that women could hold power, control wealth, and make their own decisions. Runestones are Viking billboards, memorials raised along roads and in places of traffic, meant to be seen, meant to be read. They tell us who lived, who died, who loved them, who wanted them remembered. And many of them were commissioned by women. The Morby runestone in Upland near Stockholm was raised by a woman named Gulag. The inscription reads, Gulag made this bridge for her daughter Yilag's soul, who was wife of Ulf, a woman honoring her daughter, not her husband, not her son, her daughter, and she paid for a bridge to be built, a structure that would serve the community, that would carry travelers and traders and the dead to their burials for salvation of her child's soul. The Vinga runestone, also in Upland, was raised by a woman named Thorgethur. Her name means Thor's protection. It's a pagan name, a name that invokes the old god, the god of thunder, the protector of farms and families. But the stone bears a Christian cross. Thorgethur, Thor's protection, raised a Christian monument. Did she convert? Or did her family convert after her death? We don't know. But the stone itself, with its pagan name and its Christian cross, is a record of a woman living at the intersection of worlds. There are about 145 runestones that refer to bridge building. Missionaries often suggested that building a bridge or causeway over deep waters and foul ways for the love of God was a worthy act, a way of earning prayers for the dead, and a surprising number of these inscriptions were commissioned by or were erected in memory of women. These runestones are not exceptions, they are evidence. Women in the Viking Age had wealth. They had status. They had the authority to commission public monuments, to build bridges, to shape the landscape. And yet, for generations, scholars treated them as anomalies. The same assumption that hid the warrior Birka for 140 years, was that power belonged to men. A runestone raised by a woman was curious, unusual, not part of the main story. But the main story is changing. At the Gotland Museum, among the display of women's brooches and keys, there are also picture stones. These carved limestone monuments from the Vendel period show ships and warriors and sometimes women. The museum in Visby has one of the finest collections of these stones in Sweden. Standing there, looking at these stones, it's impossible to miss the presence of women in the Viking world. They are not hidden. They are not exceptions. They are carved into the record, waiting for us to read them correctly. In 1998, archaeologist Liv Helga Domasness wrote something that still echoes. She said that despite the plentiful archaeological sources from the Viking Age, not many archaeologists took advantage of the opportunities they represented. The picture commonly presented was of men in their various occupations, with scant mention of women and children who were also part of it. That was nearly 30 years ago. Things have changed, but not enough. Today, a new generation of scholars is re examining old collections with fresh eyes. Shanna Bryman, a PhD candidate at the University of Highlands and Islands, is developing a leadership criterion for archaeological evidence, a way to identify women who held power based on their grave goods, their rune stones, their place in the landscape. Her thesis is titled Making Her Story, Evaluating Female Leadership in the Viking Age. Marianne Moen at the University of Oslo has been re-examining Viking Age burials across Norway. She has found that women were buried with weapons more often than previously recognized, not always in the full panoply of the Birka warrior, but with axes, with spears, with arrows. The assumption for decades was that these were symbolic items, household tools, ceremonial objects. Moen asks, why do we assume a woman buried with a weapon is not a warrior, while a man buried with a weapon automatically is? Charlotte Hedenstern Janssen, who led the study that confirmed the Birka warrior was female, is now working on a larger project, mapping Viking Age mobility through isotope analysis. She is finding that women moved across the Viking world as extensively as men. They traveled, they traded, they fought, they ruled, and then they were buried, and we assumed. There is also the case of the Arvonrig burial in the Isle of Barra in Scotland. In the 19th century, a skeleton was found with a sword and what was interpreted as a shield. The excavator declared it the grave of an aged man. But in 1990, a re examination of the objects revealed something surprising. The sword was actually a weaving baton. The shield was a pair of heckles, textile equipment. The person buried there, in the absence of any skeletal remains that could confirm sex, was almost certainly a woman buried with the tools of her trade, not weapons, but the tools of textile production. And yet, because a sword had been assumed, the grave was assigned to a man for more than half a century. The Birka's warrior's reidentification is just the beginning. How many other warrior graves and museum collections are waiting for re-examination? How many women have been buried in the ground, their accomplishments overlooked because archaeologists assume the bodies with weapons must be male, or because a weaving tool was mistaken for a sword? How many runestones raised by women have been read as anomalies rather than evidence? How much of Viking history needs to be rewritten? The work is ongoing, and it is, in its own way, an excavation of bias as much as soil. In episode 7, I mentioned something I hadn't expected to find. I'd been exploring ancient DNA comparisons using a research service that matches modern DNA to published ancient genomes. I was curious about the Baltic world we'd been discussing, the Vendel period, the ships crossing between Sweden, Gotland, and Estonia, the people who lived and died in that connected world. I didn't expect to find myself in that world, but I did. Among my closest ancient matches were individuals from the very regions we've been exploring: the Baltic, Gotland, the Malaran Valley, people who lived and died in the same centuries as women we've been talking about in this episode. Let me tell you about some of them. There is a woman named VK429. She lived on Gotland around the year 975 during the late Viking Age. Her remains were discovered at the Frøyel harbor site, the same place I stood when I visited Gotland, looking out across the Baltic, watching the island of Little Karlsö rise from the sea. She was buried there, in the soul of that ancient trading port. We don't know her name, we don't know what she looked like or what she believed, but through archaeology and genetics, we know she existed. And I am a 67% closer match to her than most other users in that database. Not a direct ancestor, the evidence can't tell me that, but a connection, a thread across 1,000 years. There is another woman, LAU001. She lived in Gotland as well, but earlier, around the year 600 in the Vendel period, the world before the Vikings. She was buried in a rich grave, a woman of status, someone who mattered to her community. The archaeologists who excavated her grave called it a rich grave female. That's all we know, but I match her too. The woman from the Vendel period, the woman from the Viking Age harbor, two women from Gotland, separated by nearly 400 years, connected by the same soil, the same sea, the same islands, and connected somehow to me. But Gotland is not the only place where my genetic threads run. There is a cemetery in Västergötland called Varnhem. You've heard about it in the last episode. It's where Kata is buried, the wealthy woman who built one of Sweden's first Christian churches on her own land. The cemetery at Varnhem holds thousands of graves, and I match with more than a dozen of the women buried there. VK42, VK35, VK34, VK398, VK399, VK402, VK404, VK424, VK426, VK308, VK306, VK303. Those are their catalog numbers, the only names they have. Women who lived in the 11th century who were buried in the same churchyard as Kata, who watched the old gods fade and the new god arrive. Some of them were buried with crosses, some of them carried the old names like Thorguther. They lived at the intersection of worlds, and I am a 30 to 70% closer match to each of them than most other users. That is not nothing. That is not random. That is a cluster, a group of women from the same community, the same cemetery, the same centuries, and my genetic makeup aligns with theirs. But the connections don't stop in Sweden. There was a man named WES004. He lived in Jutland in central Sweden around the year 1016. He was buried in a grave that archaeologists call late Viking Age, and I share 347 centimorgans of DNA with him. For those that don't follow genetic genealogy, 347 centimorgans is a significant amount. It's the kind of number you might see between distant cousins. My raw DNA is 45% closer to him than other users. He is not a name. He is not a story. He is just a person who lived and died in Sweden 1,000 years ago. But the connection is real. There is VK1, a Viking settler in Greenland, someone who crossed the North Atlantic, who lived in one of the most remote places on Earth, who survived in a landscape of ice and snow and sea. My raw DNA is 94% closer to this person than other users. And then there's VK166, a victim of the St. Brice's Day massacre in Oxford, England in the year 1002. On that day, King Ethelred the Unready ordered the killing of all Danes living in England. This person, a Viking, a settler, perhaps someone who had lived in England for years, was killed far from home, among strangers, violently. I am an 83 closer match to him than other users. A woman from the Vendel period in Gotland, a woman from the Viking Age harbor in Foyel, a dozen women from the cemetery at Varnhem, a man from Jutland, a settler from Greenland, a victim of the massacre in Oxford. These are not names. These are not ancestors I can claim with certainty. They are echoes, threads, connections that the ground has preserved and that DNA has revealed. Here is what I want you to understand. When I stood in the Gotland Museum in Visby, looking at the display of women's brooches and keys, the bronze brooches, the iron keys, the spindle whorls, I was not just looking at artifacts. I was looking at material remains of people who, it turns out, are some of my closest ancient matches. When I walked through the Nordic Museum in Stockholm, seeing the objects that cross continents, the beads from Baghdad, the silk from the East, the coins from the Chalcofate, I was looking at a world that my genetic matches lived in. I don't know if any of these women are my direct ancestors. The evidence can't tell me that. Ancient DNA comparisons work by identifying shared genetic similarities across populations, not by proving direct descent. But what the evidence does suggest is something I find extraordinary. The genetic landscape of the Viking world, the Baltic networks, the Gotland trading posts, the Varnhem churchyard still echoes in people today. And some of those echoes run through me. And maybe they run through you. The woman engraved BJ581, the warrior of Birka, was not connected to me as far as I know. My matches don't include her. But the women of Gotland, the women of Varnhem, the settler in Greenland, the victim of the massacre, they are in my match list. They are part of my story, not because I can prove descent, but because the threads are there, the connections are there, the soil remembers, and now so do I. The Viking women we've met in this episode, the warrior, the weaver, the traveler, the queen, the runestone raiser, the bridge builder, they are not abstract figures from a distant past. They are connected to us, not by blood necessarily, but by something, by the fact that we are here, standing in the same landscape, looking at the same water, asking the same questions. And for me, the connection is a little closer, a little more personal, a little harder to ignore. The threads run through the Baltic, through Gotland, through Varnhem, through Jutland, through Greenland, through Oxford, and they run through me. The phrase, she held the keys, has meant many things across history. In the Viking Age, it meant authority, it meant management, it meant power over the household, the farm, the resources. But I think it means something else too. The women we've met in this episode, the warrior of Birka, the weavers of sails, the travelers who crossed oceans, the queens buried in ships, the runestone raisers, the bridge builders, the women who held keys and spindles and swords, they hold something else. They hold the keys to a different understanding of the Viking Age, a version of history that is not just about men and their weapons, but about families and communities and the labor that made everything possible. But here's what I keep turning over. We've spent this episode trying to see Viking women more clearly, to correct the assumptions of generations of scholars, to bring figures like the Birka warrior and Aud the Deep-Minded and Queen Thyra out of the shadows. But are we seeing them clearly now, or are we seeing what we want to see? The 19th century scholars who looked at the Birka grave saw a male warrior because that's what their world expected. We look at the same grave and we see a female warrior because that's what our world expects. We want strong women. We want evidence that the past was not as patriarchal as we feared. We want to find ancestors who looked like us, thought like us, defied the expectations of their time. Is that any less of an assumption? The scholar Judith Yesh, who wrote the definitive study Women in the Viking Age, warns against what she calls the danger of overinterpretation. Just because a woman was buried with weapons does not necessarily mean she was a warrior. The weapons could have been symbols of family status. The grave could have been a memorial for someone buried elsewhere. The burial practices of the Viking Age are complex, and we don't fully understand them. The archaeologist Marianne Moen puts it differently. She says we are simply asking the wrong questions. Perhaps less rigidity in expected generals may be the answer to how to interpret such apparently transgressive burials. So, what are the right questions? Maybe they are not, was this woman a warrior or was this woman a queen? Maybe they are, what did this person do in their community? What did their neighbors think of them? What did they believe about the world and their place in it? What did they want to carry with them into whatever came next? And here's another question, one that connects the Viking Age to our own time. Why does it matter to us today in the 21st century whether Viking women were warriors or not? In the Nordic countries today, gender equality is a fundamental part of the national brand. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Iceland consistently rank at the top of global gender equality indexes. Fathers push strollers. Women lead political parties. The idea that Nordic women have always been independent, strong, and equal to men is a powerful story, but that story has a dark side. The same image of the independent Viking woman, tall, blonde, white, strong, has been used by far right groups to exclude others. If gender equality is inherently Nordic, then people who do not embody that ideal or who come from other cultures perceived as less gender equal can be framed as threats to Nordic identity. The Sweden Democrats or SD party, the Soldiers of Odin, the Nordic resistance movement, they are all using Viking imagery and symbolism. They claim the old gods, they claim the warrior women, they claim a past that never quite existed, and they use it to justify a future that many of us do not want. So here is the question I keep coming back to. When we tell stories about the past, about Viking women, about warriors, about queens, whose interests are we serving? Who benefits from the way we remember? The 19th century scholars who saw only men in the graves were serving their own assumptions. The nationalists who claim Lagertha as a symbol of pure Nordic strength are serving their own agendas. And me, I am telling this story, shaping it, choosing which details to include and which to leave out. I don't have an answer. That's not the point. The point is to keep asking, to keep questioning our own assumptions, to remember that the past is not a mirror. It does not exist to confirm what we already believe. It is strange. It is messy. It is full of people who thought differently than we do, who lived in worlds we can only partially understand. The woman in grave BJ581 was a warrior, or she wasn't. She was a leader, or she was a symbol. She was someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone's friend. She traveled far. She died young. She was buried with care. We will never know her name. We will never know what she believed or what she wanted or what she feared. But we see her now, not clearly, not completely, but we see her. And maybe that is enough to see her, to wonder about her, to hold space for her in our understanding of the past, to admit we don't have all the answers and that we never will. The keys she held, if she held them, unlocked chests and doors and storage rooms, but they also unlock something else, a different way of thinking about history, a way that does not assume, does not dismiss, does not reduce people to categories we invented long after they were gone. She held the keys, and now so do we. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the lives of Viking women, the ones who held the keys, the ones who sailed ships, and the ones who raised the stones, and the ones who have been waiting for us to see them. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the podcast so you don't miss the next one. Following helps more people discover it, and it lets you know whenever a new episode comes out. And if you know someone who'd appreciate a different kind of history podcast, please share it with them. Next time, we'll turn to something new, something we've been building towards since the beginning, the formation of Sweden itself, how the petty kingdoms became a kingdom, and how the thing became a law, how the people who lived in this landscape began to imagine themselves as something more than just farmers, traders, and warriors. They began to imagine themselves as Svea, as Jiter, as something that would be eventually called Svea, Sweden. But that's next time. For now, imagine a woman standing on the shore of Lake Mälaren in a town of Birka in the 9th century. She is wearing a woolen dress held up by bronze brooches. Around her neck, a silver Thor's hammer, or maybe already a cross, and in her hand a key, in her other hand a spindle. She is watching ships leave for the east. She is weighing silver on a small folding scale. She is making decisions that will shape the lives of everyone who depends on her. She is not a footnote. She was never a footnote. We just weren't looking, but we are looking now. Until next time, keep looking beyond the Swedish postcard. And if you'd like to see some of the places and objects we've talked about in this episode, I will add them to the description and also have a link on my website now with all the museums that we talk about. And I also have a podcast guide. So check that out. It's swedishwanderlust.com. And hey do for now.